doing it right now. All right, let's do this over again. Thank you guys for being so patient. This is Undone Life Together. This isn't perfect life together, right? So just consider this an object lesson for our whole conversation today. Isn't that great? Once again, for those of you who are brand new, this is Undone Life Together, a 5-week conversation about the unexpected life. We have about almost 1,000 people participating in the 5-week conversation on Facebook, over email, and over Blab. And once a week, we do this live Blab session where we pick a hot topic for the week and we just kind of talk unplugged about it and kind of unpack it together. So this is totally for you. And today the subject is control, which, as I told Sherry and our friends over on the Undone Life Together Facebook page, it's not exactly rainbows and bunnies. This is not exactly a fun conversation. However, for those of us who tend to find ourselves trying to be hyper vigilant about controlling all the details of your life, I think you're going to have some good news today. And I think you're going to end up feeling more normal than you think you are, but hopefully some really good tips for how you can process through that. To begin, again, this idea of control, I read an excerpt from the book a moment ago. If we had some technical difficulties with the video, it kind of dropped out and shut everything off, so we had to start over. For those of you who are part of the Undone Life Together conversation, you can find that on page 91, where I was talking about how initially, when I was first diagnosed with cancer, my initial response, how do you respond to something like that? It's very earth-shattering. Everything shakes up. And so my first response was to try to control whatever details I could possibly control, and which was a real treat for my family, let me just say. It was very exciting for them. But that first day I was diagnosed, as soon as I hung up the phone with the doctor, I went to the grocery store to get groceries for Thanksgiving dinner. And rather than picking up like $100 worth of, baked potatoes and, all of that kind of stuff, I spent almost $400 on groceries that day. And why do you think I did that? Because it was one thing I could control. It was one thing that I could do. It was one thing that I could be in charge of. I couldn't be in charge of my health. Everything fell out of control, but I could make sure that everybody who came to my house for Thanksgiving left full. So I went a little over the top. And now I think it's hilarious because now in hindsight, I know the whole reason for that was a feeling of a lack of control and an almost desperation to be in control of something.
How many Tupperwares did you need for all the leftovers?
Well, and because I wasn't eating, I was so sick to my stomach from worry, I wasn't eating. So quite a bit. But, we have a big family, so we went through it fairly quickly. Have you had a moment like that, Sherry, where you found yourself controlling or trying to control even an insignificant detail in your life because there was a bigger detail that you couldn't?
Mine is actually almost the opposite. What comes to my mind is when I was at a stage of life where everything was out of control. So I controlled the one big thing. And that was when I was a teenager and developed my eating disorder. And, my brother had gotten into drugs, and my mother was depressed. My father was working, and, just all the normal anxieties and worries of being a teenager. And so instead of trying to control lots of little things, I picked one thing. And boy, that control, I can still remember how, I don't want to say good because I know it's the wrong word, but I remember the comfort that control gave me, even though it was for very small periods of time. So I think in your case, you have a great illustration of controlling little things because you had this big thing, and mine was kind of the flip side of that.
Yeah, I had some of the more intense things as well. Give me time. We have a half an hour more of my dysfunction. But I had some of the small things, but I had some of the, obnoxious things as well.
Now help us out. We banter this word control around. Do we even know what it means? I think we recoil from it. No woman wants to be called a control freak, but help us understand what is control in the first place.
Yeah, we do resent that title, just a shade. Okay, so I actually looked it up because I wanted to know. I wanted to know exactly what it was. By the way, Mary Snyder just commented on the side that control is a myth. True, Mary, but that doesn't keep any of us, or it doesn't keep me from making it a full-time job. All right, so control, what is it? Definition, according to Merriam-Webster, it's as a noun, when you use it as a noun, it's the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. The power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events, which I resonate with. If you use it as a verb, it's to determine the behavior or supervise the running of. Okay, I like that last one, to supervise the running of. Because basically, for me, control was a means of me supervising the running of my life. I didn't have the time or space or emotion to let it get out of control. And cancer made me feel like my life was getting out of control. Beyond cancer, let's talk about other things that made me feel like I needed to supervise my life. How about parenting? Or marriage? I love my husband, love being married, but boy, being married shows you every single day that you are not in 100% control, right? There's this whole other person and personality that you're working with. Or career or finances. I mean, we could go on and on. There were so many reasons why I felt almost desperate to regain some control over my life. And like you mentioned about your childhood and all the different chaos that was happening, control becomes a means to supervise the running of your life or to influence or direct another person's behavior. Now, the good news is this can be beneficial at times, right? Self-control is not a bad thing.
One of the gifts of the Spirit.
And yeah, absolutely. As a parent with young children, we need to have some measure of control because it's what keeps them from, eating gummy worms for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it's not entirely a bad thing. So, the hardest thing is figuring out when it crosses the line to becoming something that is detrimental both to ourselves and others, and when it's a healthy thing. And that's kind of what we're going to unpack.
Yeah, Mary Snyder's using that word manipulation. I don't know who let her in this chat room, but I think we should have her,
Mary.
I think we should have her call in a bit and explain these things we don't understand at all. Because of course we don't resonate with that concept.
Manipulation. I would never do anything like that.
She says she's here to manipulate.
All right. By the way, side note for those of you who are watching the live recording of this, feel free to add your comments and your thoughts in that sidebar. It really makes it so much more fun for all of us if we know what you're thinking, what is resonating with you, what questions you have. That's what that sidebar is for. We're watching it. We're paying attention. We'd love to answer your questions. We promise we won't embarrass you or call you out if you really don't want us to. We promise. But do participate. That's what it's all about. This is a nice small picture. Us all sitting around drinking I have tea today, blueberry green tea, and just picture us all sitting around and unpacking this together. That's what it's all about. One other interesting thing I noticed about control when I looked it up is the origin. So the origin of control comes from, it's a late Middle English word, and it is sourced in this idea of to check or verify accounts. Okay, check or verify accounts. It is also Anglo-Norman French for keeping a copy of a roll of accounts, which I thought was interesting because so many times when we slip into control, we're keeping a roll of accounts on other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't get hysterical. I get historical.
Okay, that's quotable. Somebody needs to remember that and quote Sherry Gregory on Twitter
stolen,
about that.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. Okay, so now let's talk about who controls. Okay, who controls? Well, to some extent, by the way, I see that a couple of you are calling in. Hang out. I'm going to get to you in like 1 second. So keep calling in. I will bring you on in just a moment. I think I see Wendy is calling in and one other person, I can't see the name, but I will get to it, I promise. So who controls? All of us do in some measure. Again, control is not bad in and of itself. It's when it gets out of control, when it gets to be too much. So who controls? All of us. One interesting thing for me has been as a parent, especially a parent who has kids who came from a traumatic background. So my youngest kids joined our family when they were 4 years old. And their history isn't an easy history because they went through a lot of changes earlier in their life. What I have found by watching them is, for them, control is a means of safety and self-preservation. They learned control very early as a means of survival. So that wasn't necessarily a bad thing when they were in a position of chaos. However, when you're in a position of safety, or you're in a position where you're in relationship with other semi-healthy people, I say we're semi-healthy, constantly wielding control as a self-protective mechanism not only cuts you off from a healthy relationship, but it also damages the potential of that relationship down the road. And, again, these are just kids, so they're learning just like I'm learning, but it's been so good for me to see, because they've taught me to recognize it in myself and to get beyond just the evidence of it, to actually understand the source of it. Just as their control needs are sourced somewhere, so are mine. And the more we can understand that and kind of back up further and unpack it, then it takes some of the power out of our need to control. Okay, let me bring on Wendy here real quick and see if she has a question. Wendy, I'm bringing you on. And sometimes it takes a while for the internet to pick up on the additional person. So if it takes a second, don't worry. By the way, when she comes on, give her props. See those little hands in the lower right hand corner of her name. It's not easy to come on and ask your question or to be part of the conversation live. So give her some love. And by the way, Sherry and I need love too. We're just human. Okay, so Wendy's coming on. If you guys have a question and you don't want to call in, but you want to ask a question, you can type it in the sidebar by using /Q. /Q, and then type your question. It then send it over to us so we can see it. That way, if you really, let's say you're sitting at home in your pajamas and no makeup and you want to ask a question, that would be a great way for you to do it, and then you don't have to come on live. All right. Wendy is trying to come on, but it's not showing her. Wendy, can you hear me? I am asking her to refresh her screen. See if that will work, and try again.
One thing I noticed, and I think it kind of ties into what you were talking about with your kids, as I was reading through the control discussion on the Facebook page, which was fascinating. It was kind of like looking into a mirror. But several people brought up this whole idea of rules. And you, of course, talked about, being a rule follower as a means of controlling your circumstances. But one person, I printed this out even, pointed out that when she was young, her father had disappeared and just never came back. And so the belief she ended up with was, if only I had been awake, I could have stopped him. And so some of these rules aren't even rules like, well, you should wait for the light to cross the street, which we, are taught. These are these kind of internal rules. And I saw this happen with my students 3 years ago. A beloved teacher suffered a massive stroke on Christmas Eve and died on New Year's Eve. And I had never gone through a grief experience like that. And the number of students who really believed that they should have been able to stop it, and they had meant to go talk to him on the day he injured himself, and they felt that they could have prevented it. And so they ended up with this tremendous guilt about having not done it. And so they ended up with this kind of a rule. And as I did some research on convoluted and complicated grief, this showed up in the literature, that making up rules and belief systems surrounding unresolved grief is really common. And I thought that kind of, your littles may not be in the least bit conscious of a grief process that they're in, but these uncodified rules that they follow to try to have control are part of that loss. And like you said, are part of trying to create safety.
Exactly. And I have found myself doing the same thing. Like I've become hyper vigilant about making sure everybody gets to bed exactly on time. Sounds like such a silly thing, but when you feel so maxed out on everything, when 7:30 rolls around, everybody needs to be in bed. Otherwise, I almost, sometimes feel like I can't even hardly handle it because I feel so overstimulated by the chaos of life. And so watching myself do some of those things, and why does it bother me if the night gets busy and everybody doesn't get to bed till 8? Why is that bothering me so much? What is that all about? And some of it is that whole rule thing is such a big deal for making me feel safe. And so I can take that too far, but understanding it really
Oh,
helps.
absolutely.
That's so insightful. Friar Wade asked a question um, here, and I think Wendy is going to try to call in here again in a second. But Friar Wade asked, speaking of control, how does self-control fit into the equation?
Question.
You want to take that, Sherry?
Oh, thank you. I was waiting to hear you first.
Well, again, I would go back to self-control is not a bad. It's not a bad thing. Of course, we can overdo it with ourselves too, where we are so hard on ourselves, and so we have built so many rules around our own lives and how we should behave and how we should respond that we unravel and freak out if we make any mistake. And some of that can be chaos induced as well.
The first word that comes to my mind in terms of the difference between self-control and unhealthy obsessive control is compulsion. I know that, since, I have to still be conscious about things with having to do with food. Last week, I pointed out that when I feel afraid, sometimes I find myself in the kitchen, and I guarantee you I'm not reaching for apples and carrot sticks. I'm reaching for my two best friends, Ben and Jerry, and unopened with a spoon, and at that.
Oh, give her some props. Come on. You're not the only one. I'm not going to let you hang out there with Ben and Jerry by yourself.
But at that point, what does self-control look like? Does self-control look like, oh my goodness, now I can't have anything? Does self-control, and of course, it's going to end up being for me, that's conversational prayer at that point. I on my own, I know I'm probably not going to make particularly wise choices. And so I'm going to have to breathe through it. I'm going to have to recognize, oh my goodness, I have these two options. I can be very compulsive and very rigid, and I can follow some rules now. Or I can kind of relax into it because God created food. And this is not for me something like alcoholism where I can just not have any alcohol. Mm-hmm. The kitchen needs to be there. I need to enter it. I need to sit at the dining room table. And so, for me, self-control means whatever the meal is going to be eaten in a very normal, healthy, relaxed manner at the table, not with my head still inside the freezer, as I'm engaging in this really very out of control behavior that's supposed to help me gain control. So that's kind of a convoluted answer to a very specific example for me. How about you? How can you tell the difference between when you're in an unhealthy form of control and it really is a form of, the fruit of the spirit of self-control?
For me, some of it is just being very in tune to my own emotions. So when there is even a hint of desperation, that's usually a clue to me. Even a hint of desperation, if there's a sense of panic, if my blood pressure is high, my heart rate's high. I mean, just those basic kind of scientific clues tell me a lot about what the motive is behind
this. Has to happen because it has to happen because it has to happen.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing I find is when I feel that desperation and I'm not able to get that need met or whatever, I either cry or I become angry. One of those two kind of responses, and that tells me something as well. Okay, why was that so important? Why is it that big of a deal? Because most of the time it isn't that big of a deal. So why am I responding with such a strong emotion? Whenever the emotion doesn't necessarily coincide with the circumstance, that's always a great clue for me.
That's quotable.
Yeah. Well, it goes back. Let's think of that bedtime. That's such a small example. But if it's 7:45 and I burst into tears because my kids are still awake, I've been parenting for a long time. I have 6 kids. That's not earth-shattering. That's not a life and death scenario. So why does that cause that kind of emotion? And that's what tells me, okay, there's something else driving this that's not so healthy, and that I need to spend some time unpacking that. All right, so we talked about the definition of control. We talked about the origin of the word control. We talked about who controls, which is basically all of us to some extent. And if you are someone who has no control issues at all, then that actually is not good either. That means you could use some self-control. So again, the whole idea is not that we shouldn't have this element in our life, but when does it become dangerous? And then how can we process it and get back to a place of being more healthy? Now let's talk about why we control, because this is really, in my opinion, based on my experience, this is really the crux of it. I mean, this is the nuts and bolts, why we do it. If we don't take time to figure out why we're doing this, then we're just throwing Advil at the headache rather than trying to find the source of the headache. And control, we really need to get to the source of why we feel a need to do it in order to overcome it. We just have to. Real quick, Alley-oop made a comment that he, I can't tell, sorry, Alley-oop, you cry and become angry as well. I think that's very, very common. Those are the two emotions we resort to when anything feels out of control. It's so common. And then that whole fear thing, which can fuel both of those responses as well. Okay, so why control? There's ultimately really two reasons, based on my experience, why we kind of launch into a control place. Two kind of inciting incidences, let's say. I'm such a storyteller. So an inciting incident is really what launches us into conflict or tension in the story. The first is an unfilled need. Some kind of unfilled need. So you can think of that in terms of marriage or an unfilled need. Let's say you're a child in a home where you don't feel safe. That's an unfilled need. Or you don't feel loved, or you've been neglected, or whatever. So some kind of unfilled need. The second would be fear, anxiety. Those are the two chief roots behind all hypervigilant, out of control sense of control. All right? An unfilled need or fear, anxiety. Do you see either one of those or both of those playing out in your life?
Oh, Sarah? My goodness. I was trying to figure out. I think my fear and anxiety stem from the unmet needs. And so it really, I think for me goes back to that particular one. I was thinking this morning, one of my ways of controlling, and boy, Mary, she's going to nail me for this one, for manipulation. In my friendships, I tend to do my best to overgive and to outdo the other person, so that I'm always several steps ahead. And it all comes from, when I'm conscious of it, I recognize that it all comes from 7th grade. I had a best friend, and one day she decided she hated me. And when a mutual friend asked her, well, don't you feel bad losing your friendship with Sherry? She said, I'm not losing anything. I'm throwing it away because that's what you do with trash. And so my driving force has been to become indispensable. I know I'm not going to be wanted. Nobody's going to want me, but they can at least need me. And so if I make myself useful enough, if I become somebody that they can't live without, then I'll be indispensable, which means they at least they won't trash me. They won't toss me in the trash. And so when I find myself, and it looks so good, it looks in a relationship.
Well, absolutely. Right? Because you're achieving,
I'm contributing. I mean, it's like the Christian virtue of serving, except my motive is a very, very needy one. And so for me to have to, and I'm slowly learning to pause and go, okay, am I doing this because God is calling me? Is this something I'm doing with God? Or is this something I'm doing for God, but really I'm doing it to make sure that I'm so important in this person's life that they're not going to, leave me behind. And Absolutely. So it definitely stems from the need for the for relationships and affirmation, and the fear that I'm going to get tossed. Never mind the reality that in this entire world, 90% of the people aren't going to like me particularly. I'm just not going to be a good fit for them. And frankly, I'm not a good fit for them. So why I want everybody to hang on to me, I'm slowly losing that desire. I want to be polite and kind, but I don't need to be needed nearly as badly as I used to.
It would be interesting for all of us to sit down and catalog where we spend most of our time, right? Where we spend most of our time invested. It could be everything from church service to community service to volunteering at our kids' school to our career and our aspirations. And to catalog that and unpack, okay, what's really driving all of this activity? I mean, I almost wonder, I wonder how much of what I do, I mean, if you could really quantify it percentage-wise, how much of my time is actually spent in a drive to fulfill a need or to overcome a fear versus doing it simply because I enjoy it.
I came up with a question that I try to remember. I don't always succeed, but we talked about this last week. We tend to ask ourselves, what's wrong with me in the midst of a situation? I'm learning to ask myself, what's going on with me? Instead of what's wrong, what's going on. Question. And that helps me answer the question that you just posed.
Mm-hmm. I have a similar question. This is more about gauging responses of other people. But when somebody, if there's a rejection or a pushback or something where I feel less than with somebody else, my response used to always be, "What's wrong with me?"
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I ultimately, it was easier to come back to the fact that I'm responsible, because if I'm responsible, I can do something
Fix
about
it.
that. If the other person's responsible, I'm out of control. So it's much easier for me to say, "What's wrong with me?"
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that creates all kinds of emotional issues because I'm constantly not feeling good enough. And so one thing I've learned to do is not automatically default to the "what's wrong with me," that I didn't get that job, or didn't get that engagement, or didn't have that friend call, or wasn't included in that gathering. Instead of saying "what's wrong with me," saying, "what does that tell me about them?"
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Mm-hmm.
nothing, but what does that tell me about the scenario,
Uh-huh.
or what does that communicate to me about them? And that way, not everything has me as the root of all problems of the world, but it also takes me out of control and teaches me how to
Yeah.
be okay with other people not always being okay.
You know, one of the other things I realize is when I make meaning, when I ask myself, what does this mean about me? I'm mean to myself. So, you know, when I ask that question, well, what's wrong with me? Because I'm trying to figure out the meaning of a circumstance. Like you said, let's say I wasn't included in an invitation. I'm not going to then say, oh, well, it just means they don't recognize a wonderful person I am. I'm always going to bash on myself. So anytime we
Mm-hmm.
start meaning making, at least in my experience, I become mean. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just going back on the hamster treadmill, back around the crawl
Oh, yeah.
cycle again.
Well, back to this whole idea of why we control again, the main two roots, the driving forces of control, are almost always an unfilled need or some kind of fear. And often they go hand in hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fear of an unfilled need, you know, they go together so often. And behind all of that is, in many cases, we want A plus B to equal C. We want everything to be fair. We want things to add up. We want to know that if we put in 10 minutes of effort, we're going to get a 10-minute result. You know, we want everything we just basically want the math to work.
Mm-hmm.
And when the math doesn't work, which, let's be honest, most of life, the math doesn't work. That's the reason we're talking about undone life.
Yeah.
When the math doesn't work, we kind of roll up our sleeves and be very hyper vigilant in trying to make the math work. I had this image when I was thinking through this yesterday of that scene at the end of Cinderella. Have you seen the most recent
Yes,
Cinderella
I
movie?
love it.
I love it. I actually really
Yeah.
love it. Uh, I usually watch guy movies with all my older boys, but I really love this one. But at the end of the movie, there's a scene where the stepsisters are trying to cram their feet into the too small shoe. And I think that's what we end up doing with the people around us and with ourselves and with our circumstances. It was when the math doesn't work in our life, when things aren't going according to plan, we become like the stepsisters who are trying to cram ourselves and cram the people around us into a shoe that doesn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
And the result is uh, a lot of pain for ourselves personally, but pain for other people as well, because we are trying to force something that's just not going to
Are you
happen.
suggesting we look as ridiculous as they did too?
I won't say that about any of you. Let's just say I know how ridiculous I look.
It feels so logical in the moment. But you know, you used a word
Oh,
earlier, and that's desperate. I think that's a really, really good word to keep in mind, because that's a scene of desperation, of trying to force something that, rather than relaxing and allowing. And dare I mention another movie, you know, Let It Go.
oh no, don't bring that up. Everybody's going to be unhappy with you now because they'll be singing the song.
Sorry.
But yeah, absolutely. I just thought that was such a good
Great illustration.
image for me
Mm-hmm.
to slow me down enough to know I'm trying to cram the people around me, my circumstances, even through worry. I'm trying to cram everything into a shoe that doesn't fit, and it's going to cause pain if I don't let it go. Oh no, I just said that word, that phrase, let it go. All right, so now we know why we control. What do we control? We control possessions, we control people, we try to control other people's emotions as if we can we can control their emotions. We try to control our own emotions. In fact, in this book, I talk about how that worry ended up being my means of control. Worry was a way that I could try to control the outcome of my story. I thought of it this way. Well, if I can at least spend a lot of time worrying about the worst case scenario, then when it happens, it won't be so bad. Not true. I mean, all it does is, whatever the worst case scenario is, would be hard no matter what.
Yeah.
But if I start worrying about it now, I not only have pain on the day when the worst thing happens, but I have pain every day leading up to it. It doesn't change the results. It just makes me more miserable while I wait.
And you've missed out on all sorts of moments that you could have actually been present in that real moment rather than the future worry moments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Control can look various different ways. We've talked about several of them here. It can be controlling schedules. It can be trying to just manipulate all the details of the day. I mean, there's so many different ways. The key is catch the emotion or the driving force behind it. And if you can start to pay attention to how your own body is responding or how you're responding, how you feel in the moment, your blood pressure, your heart rate, your all of that can give you clues for perhaps a behavior that might be normal in a normal circumstance isn't healthy in that moment because of what's driving it. Mm-hmm. So now we get to the really important part as we get closer to the end of this blab. How do we move past this place of hypervigilant control? I mean, how do we move past it? Because for many of us, it's become such a comfortable coping mechanism that it's so hard to change it. I mean, it's just so scary to do something different. So this is kind of my process when I go through. So when I catch myself worrying, let's say, worry was one of my big means of so-called control. So when I catch myself in that place where I have like this tape in my head playing over and over again about the worst case scenario and all the things that might go wrong and all the what ifs of what could happen, this is what I do. This is kind of my mental process of what I go. I stop first and think, okay, what's at stake here? Okay, what's really at stake here with this? And what I'm worried about, there may be a legitimate thing I'm worried about, but more than that stake, what's at stake if I continue down this control pattern?
That's a good one.
Mm-hmm. So what's at stake? If I continue to worry myself sick, what's at stake? And for me, the worry piece, which is my means of control, was my physical health, my sleep at night, my relationships, my mental health, my enjoyment of an ordinary day. I talk about in Undone how I almost missed Thanksgiving that first year after my diagnosis because I was so consumed with worrying about what may happen down the road that I didn't engage with what was right in front of me. And I had a house full of friends and family here that I almost missed out on because I was up in my room worrying about what may happen 1, 2, 5, 10 years from now. So what's at stake with that? What will I lose if I let go? So if I let go of my fear, if I let go of control, if I let go of control in this particular situation, what will I lose if I let go? And quite honestly, nothing. In my case, nothing. Because my worry was accomplishing zero. It wasn't changing the outcome at all. So what did I lose if I let go? Absolutely nothing. Yeah. What did I gain if I let go? Oh, sleep, stronger relationships, more memories, joy, the ability to enjoy the moment rather than living in the what ifs of what may or may not come. And ultimately, after I walk through those 3 questions, what's at stake? What will I lose if I let go? What will I gain if I let go? I landed at this place where I realized that really, ultimately, this whole idea of control, and you know it's coming, right? Brace yourself. You ready? This whole idea of control, from a spiritual standpoint, all boils back to trust. I know. I hate to say that.
No.
But it really boils down to trust. So if you have zero faith in God at all whatsoever, then you really are the only person that can control your life, right? So that there's not much that I can say about that. If you are someone who believes in a real and loving God who is sovereign and who is ultimately the definition of love, then any efforts that we have to be over the top hyper vigilant about control really come back to the fact that, do I really trust in the love and sovereignty of God?
Mm-hmm.
And that's ultimately the question. And that's where I had to land and start building the trust up versus tearing the control down.
Oh,
Does that
that
make
makes
sense?
total sense. Total sense.
I had spent a lifetime trying to treat the symptoms of control, trying to be less controlling, okay? Trying to be less hypervigilant about that. I can treat that all day long, but if I haven't shorn up my trust in the sovereign and loving God, it doesn't matter how much I treat my control. Again, I can throw Tylenol at that all day long.
Yeah.
The control is going to come back. Where I needed to invest my time was not in trying to just do a better job of control and how I handle that, but I need to really get on my knees and go, okay, do I trust God or not? Do I believe his character or not? Do I trust that he's loving or not? And where I didn't have the trust that I wanted to have, ask him to help me build that up, and then to spend some time reacquainting myself with the character of God so I could trust him.
That makes total
Now,
sense, because then what you're describing is those actions of trust are going to replace the frenzy for control, because it can't exist at the same. It's like the brain research on gratitude, which I'm sure we'll talk about in future weeks. You can't have all the negative emotions while the brain is processing gratitude, because the brain doesn't work that way. And so while you're in those actions and attitudes of trust, the rest is can't happen. So what does that look like for you? I know we're wrapping up here, but just give us an idea of something tangible or visual, or what it looks like in everyday life.
Okay. Well, I wrote down this is my 4-step process, and then I'll give you practical with each of it, but basically to admit it. So when I have a moment where I'm feeling out of control and I either have a tearful or angry response to something that doesn't fit, that's my clue. Okay, what's going on here? Why am I emotional about something that I don't necessarily need to be this emotional about? Stop for a moment. Okay, what is this all about? So admit it. Okay, there's something going on here. I'm either feeling afraid, or I'm feeling there's some kind of need that's unmet that I'm afraid isn't going to be met. So what is it? And then name it. So I admit it. I have to name it, call it what it is. So what is the need? What is the fear? Then I normalize it, because let's be honest, this life is scary sometimes. And some of the fears that we have and the unmet needs that we have are valid and legitimate and significant. And so not only do we need to admit it and name it, but then normalize it to some extent. So I'm kind to myself and say, you know what? It's not an easy thing living with this fear that you could die at any moment. And it's not easy living, let's say for my kids, it's not easy adapting to a new family when their original family didn't prove to be safe. I mean, that's not easy. So normalize it and be kind with yourself with it. And then allow yourself to understand it. Okay, if I saw another man or woman with a brand new diagnosis and they're scared to death about whether or not they're going to be around, I would be so empathetic with them. I would be so compassionate with their emotional responses. But when it comes to myself, I don't have the same kindness with myself. So admit it, name it, normalize it, understand it, so that being willing to empathize with yourself, grieve it, I think is another thing, because there's usually a legitimate thing that we're fearing or a need that's not met. So allowing yourself to grieve it. And then once I go through that kind of process of, okay, so where am I going to build my life? I can't build it on the sand of my emotion. I can't build it on the sand of other people, because they're human and imperfect, just like I am. I can't even build on tomorrow and the future, because I have no idea what that's going to look like. So the only thing that I can truly then build a solid place to stand on is on the foundation of faith. And again, if you don't have faith, I got nothing for you. But if you have a faith in the sovereignty and love of God, a God who is eternal and who is working all things together for some kind of good story that's so much bigger than our own, then that is the cement. It's the whole story of the two builders in the Bible, the one who built his house on the sand and the one who built his house on the rock. And I've built my house on sand for way too long. And so I have to start building that on the rock. Now, the thing is, I'm still going to be afraid sometimes. It's not like the fear goes away. I just have a means now to process through it. So practically speaking, I spend time every single day reading the Bible because I need solid truth to counteract all the inaccurate perceptions that I have going through my mind sometimes. Okay, fear is a liar, right? So fear doesn't tell the truth. So if I am constantly in a place of fear, then I need to start counteracting that with truth. So I read my Bible every single day. It doesn't have to be huge hours and hours of study, but even pulling out a single verse I can kind of hang my hat on and bank on. I have scripture cards that I actually have on my website, but I use them all the time. You can buy them on the website, but it's 30 days. I think it's 33 days of scriptures, and I can read one a day. It's on a key ring, so I can carry it in my car with me wherever I go. I've passed it out to people, but it's something where I can have that one verse a day to start building up my trust. The other thing I do too is to engage in conversation about the faithfulness of God with others, because I find that if I keep it all in my head, it doesn't quite take root. But when I engage with other people who are wrestling with the same subjects and learning about God in the same process, we both end up stronger as a result. There's something about community that really build up our faith in a way that isolation can't. You really have to have both of those pieces of the puzzle. And then the other thing that I do very regularly. So read my Bible every day. Engage with other people. I spend regular time praying, which I told you last week that I'm the worst prayer in the entire world, because it's not, reading my Bible is very tangible. It's like a to-do list. I can do that, but praying feels so nebulous. But I am slowly learning, very, very imperfectly, that's the best resource at my disposal. That I need to, I absolutely desperately need to hang out with him. And when I do, and I know we talk about this all the time, but let me just say, I was shocked at how much spending 15 minutes praying with God, like totally silent and listening, made me feel so much more at peace. I know I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm like, why did I waste 44 years not doing it? And then the last practical thing that I do is I'm very careful with how I talk. Fear and disappointment, like an unmet need, gets bigger and bigger the more we rehearse it. So the more that I spend time talking about how afraid I am and how disappointed I am and how unhappy I am, and how the more that I talk about that all the time, it reinforces that. Now we have to balance that with being honest with a couple safe friends and telling the truth. But I've also learned that I need to take control of what I say. So speaking out loud truths over my life, like these are some of what I do. You know what? I will, in my bathroom, ask my family, I'll stand in my bathroom by my bathroom mirror, or as I'm getting ready, taking a shower, and I will say out loud, I have no control over the number of my days. I have no idea how long I will be here, but I am here today. And I have a good God who loves me and will not let me go until the moment he takes my hand and takes me into eternity. And so for that reason, I can be okay today.
Wow.
For today, I'm here. I'm alive. I have much to be thankful for. And so I'm not going to let myself think about tomorrow. And I will verbally do that out loud, sometimes multiple times a day, to talk myself off the ledge of fear and that uncertainty about an unmet need. So that way I'm not hyper vigilant about control in my life.
Wow.
What's your process?
Oh my goodness. I can't add anything to that because I'm still processing. Okay. I will tell, I'm watching the clock. Do I have time to tell one quick story?
Yes, one quick story and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
And by the way, for all of you that have joined us for this live recording, I'm so glad that you participated with us today because this is a hard topic. And the fact that you're here says so much about you and your heart. So that's just a side note. Thank you for engaging with this. Okay, go ahead with your story, Sherry.
Thank you. I was dying to tell you about it, and I thought, well, I'll wait until the blab. Last week, I was working on a message that I gave this Saturday, and the process did not go well. The more I tried to control by procrastinating, then I tried to control by over planning, and so I had, I basically was trying to cram an entire retreat worth of material into a 40-minute talk. So it was looking pretty disastrous. I strongly considered calling in sick, which I couldn't do because it wasn't true. But I mean, I was like, okay, I just wanted to survive the experience. The message went, I thought, reasonably well, better than I deserved. But afterwards, a woman came up to me, and she is the grandmother of a little girl who was killed by her mother 2 years ago. And she herself had to identify the body. She asked for prayer from the whole group. And but she came up to me after my message, and she just grabbed me and held me. And she said, every single word you said today was what I needed most to hear. And I thought, oh my word, I didn't do that. I didn't, that was not my thinking going into it. Obviously the Holy Spirit was completely at work. But as I drove home, I thought to myself, this goes on the calendar. This goes in my journal. Yes. This goes on a Post-it note. The day that God used the woman who procrastinated, who tried to put too much material, who wanted to cancel the last minute, but I was there for her for that moment in ways that she and I had no idea. And, I don't know the full story of the Ebenezer stones, but having memorials in our life to remember how God has worked in the past, because those are unalterable. Even if in the moment our circumstances are crazy out of control, to be able to look back at some place that he was so obviously at work, and to be able to say, I'm confused and hurt and afraid right now, but boy, I'm going to put my trust in him because I know he was there then. Thus, I know he's here now. And somewhere down the road, I'll be able to look back and see it. So that's my little story, and I'm sticking to it.
I like it. Well, what you just illustrated so well is that when we let go control a little bit, when we learn to relinquish our need to supervise the running of our lives, we end up becoming witnesses of something that is far better than anything we could have manufactured ourselves.
It's way better than control.
Far better.
Way better than imaginative control.
Oh, it is so true. And, for all of us who are participating in this, you guys know we're all in progress, right? Which means probably before 8 p.m. tonight, you'll probably do something control-ish. So be gracious with yourself. But let's all really work on not trying to cure our control needs, but to build up our lives in trust in a worthy God who can be trusted to show up and do his thing, even when we're not in charge. He really doesn't need us. He's got it covered.
So true. And Michelle, thank you. Well, I want to thank you again on behalf of everybody here and in the Facebook group and who's getting the emails. Thank you for creating this safe space for us. It is, I read the comments. I know you do too, but there's a lot of people for whom this is maybe the first time they've had a chance to explore some of these things, to voice some of these things in a very non-judgmental community where they're learning really important things that will help them be able to take those steps of trust. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's one more example of how God can take chaos and our out of control lives and turn it into something far beyond our imagination. Well, thanks for being with us today, guys. We are going to be right back here next Wednesday at 10 a.m. with another hot topic. Hopefully, I'm hoping it's going to be a little bit more like rainbows and bunnies next week because control is just hard. But I can't make any good.
We talk about chocolate.
Anyways. Yeah, we'll talk about chocolate and coffee next week. Have a great afternoon, everybody. We will see you next Wednesday. Thanks.
Good.